Hey everyone, welcome to my course. In this video, we're going to talk through the curriculum. We'll walk through it together step by step so you know exactly what to expect. This course is a little bit atypical in that you don't actually have to watch all the videos in order. You can skip some sections, but I highly recommend watching them because I did kind of create a sort of linear progression in the thought process here. However, if you want to skip back and forth, that's totally fine. So let's start with the first topic. We're going to talk about how electrical engineering interviews work. From the very high level, what does the typical process look like? How do you even get interviews in the first place? How do you make your resume good? How do you utilize LinkedIn and Glassdoor and all these other resources available to you to maximize your chances of getting an offer? Basically, what can you expect through the entire process? Then we're going to do a quick fundamentals refresher where I'm going to talk about the basic concepts of electrical engineering, just in case you might have forgotten or might not be a college student. Maybe you're a 20-year career electrical engineering veteran, but you've only focused on a certain depth of things for a certain time. I'm going to cover the breadth. What are all the fundamental electrical concepts you can expect? The next section, we're going to talk about passive components. And once we get here, this is when we're going to start getting into real-world interview questions that I've seen or that I've given in my personal experience. So we're going to start with passive components, resistors, capacitors, inductors, go from their ideal components and then go and take a look at all of the non-idealities of real-world resistors, capacitors, and inductors. After we're done with passives, we'll move on to diodes, our first semiconductor device. We're going to take a look at various different types of diodes, including standard diodes, LEDs, Zener diodes, Schottky diodes, and then look at how diodes can be used in circuits. Throughout this entire process, again, I'll be providing lots of interview questions that I've seen personally or I've given on this topic. Next, we'll go into MOSFETs. We're going to talk about MOSFETs, the N-type, P-type, their non-idealities, their parasitic components, and what circuits they're typically used in and how to actually use them. We'll go through some data sheets and also take a look at some of the potential interview questions you might be asked about MOSFETs. After that, we'll go through ideal op-amps. This is pretty much the holy grail of electrical engineering. Every single electrical engineering interview is going to have some sort of question about operational amplifiers. We'll talk about the ideal case first, and I've dedicated an entire section to the ideal op-amp case because of how important it is. We'll go through all sorts of different types of op-amp circuits, including the non-inverting amplifiers, amplifiers that are inverting. We'll take a look at differentiator circuits. We'll do all sorts of really interesting things, summing amplifiers, etc., etc. Then we'll move on to real-world op-amps, and this is a separate total section where we're going to talk about all of the non-idealities of real-world op-amps, how to choose them for a specific application. You know, the fact that they don't have infinite input resistance, infinite output resistance, etc., etc. So we'll take a look at all the non-idealities, their common mode rejection ratios, their gain bandwidth products, their stability issues, and on and on. After that, we'll go through filters. We'll start out with analog filters and what the purposes of filters are. Then we'll go through digital filters, and that will feed us nicely into digital communication protocols. This is the second holy grail of electrical engineering interviews. Pretty much every interviewer I know has asked me about I2C, SPI, UART, and all these digital communication protocols. So we'll go through every single one of the potential types of questions you could see at interviews. We'll talk through the fundamentals of how all of these protocols work and what they need in order to work. Next, we'll get into power electronics. We'll start off with linear regulators, and then we'll get into DC-DC switching converters and DC to AC switching converters, etc., etc. Power electronics is one of my favorite topics here. After that, we'll move on to batteries. So electric vehicles are a hit these days. They all have batteries. Your phones have batteries. Your laptops have batteries. How do they work? What kind of cell chemistries are there? How do the capacity work, the energy, the power, how does temperature affect them? Interviewers are going to ask you about batteries most likely, especially if you're working in a electromechanical product. So we'll cover the bases here. After that, we'll move on to motors. We'll talk about the differences between brushed and brushless motors, how to drive them, what circuits to use to drive them, etc. And then we'll get into some PCB layout questions. This is probably the third holy grail of electrical engineering interviews. How do you actually lay out a PCB if you are going to be that kind of electrical engineer? This is not really that useful for semiconductor engineers, but a well-rounded electrical engineer should know how to design a PCB. How do you size the traces? How do you make the stack up? What do the layers look like? Etc., etc. What questions you could be asked from an interviewer about this topic. And then we'll go on to software. As you know, every single electrical engineer has to know some kind of software, whether it's Python, C, C++. You got to be able to also use MATLAB as a data processing tool, and LT or HSpice for circuit simulation. So we'll get into some of the questions there. Afterwards, we'll delve deep into microprocessors and other well-rounded electrical systems. I'll give you some examples of systems engineering questions they might ask you. For example, build an electric drill for me. So we'll talk about how to design electrical systems, draw block diagrams, and how to choose processors for specific applications. After that, those are pretty much all of the electrical engineering technical questions we'll get through. I'll then move on into engineering puzzles. These are puzzle questions that a lot of interviewers here in the Bay Area and the rest of the United States like to ask because they kind of make you think outside of the box. They force you to think on specific topics that you may not necessarily be an expert in, and they'll show the interviewer how you think. So I'll give you some examples so you can see what you should be in store for. Then we'll get into the non-technical interviews. So pretty much 70% of electrical engineering interviews are technical, the rest are non-technical. You'll be asked to talk about previous projects you've worked on, talk about your experience, perhaps answer questions about, tell me about a time when something happened in the workplace, etc., etc. And then, we'll practice giving your 2-minute pitch and all sorts of other presentations you might have to do that are non-technical. After that, we'll talk about what to do when you actually get an offer, how to negotiate it, what an offer needs to look like or should look like, and how you can get the best offer from an employer that does want to hire you. And that's pretty much the end of the course. I'm excited for you and looking forward to seeing you inside.